The lake shimmered like molten silver, catching the afternoon sun as children's laughter rang out in bright, carefree notes. Harry, a lean boy of 10, raced barefoot across the pebbled shore, his feet skimming over the cool earth as if propelled by the wind itself. Behind him, his cousins shrieked and whooped, their faces flushed with joy as they splashed through the shallows. A game of hide-and-seek had burst into something freer and unbridled, their shouts blending with the rhythmic lapping of the water and the distant call of a loon. The air smelled of sun-warmed pine and the sweet, inviting aroma of pies cooling on the wide window ledge of the cabin. Harry's stomach rumbled as he caught a whiff, knowing it was Grandma May's signature, flaky crusts packed with wild blueberries they'd picked that morning. He felt the tickle of her approval in the air, as if her warm eyes were watching even when he was out of sight. Grandpa Tom sat on the porch in a creaky chair, his old straw hat tilted back as he chuckled at the children's antics. His weathered hands rested on the armrests, tapping in time with a tune only he could hear. Every now and then, he'd glance over at May, who was busying herself with another batch of pies inside but still found a moment to meet his gaze with a smile that spoke of decades of love and understanding. Harry skidded to a halt as one of his cousins lunged playfully, and they tumbled into a heap of tangled limbs, both of them breathless and laughing. For a moment, he looked up at the canopy of green above, the sunlight filtering through in a dance of gold. The lake, the laughter, the love, all of it was stitched into the fabric of his happiest memories, a warmth that reached his very core. The vision dissolved like a dream meeting the morning light, and Harry found himself back in the high-rise office that towered over the city. The skyline stretched out before him, framed by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered an unbroken view of the world he ruled but never truly touched. The suit he wore was impeccably tailored, the sheen of his silk tie catching the glow of the afternoon sun. Everything about the room was silent and pristine, from the polished walnut desk to the sleek, black leather chair that stood as a symbol of his authority. Harry had grown up in a household that thrived on ambition. His father, Hank Arnold Lynn, was known for building their family's wealth from the ground up, weaving together a network of business ventures that positioned the Arnoldlins as one of the most respected names in the industry. His mother, Caroline, was just as vital, orchestrating their social world with the elegance of someone who understood that relationships were currency. Harry, the only child, was expected to uphold this legacy. By the time he was 12, he could already quote profit margins and shadow his father at business functions without missing a mate. As an adult, Harry had expanded their empire, forging paths into technology, real estate, and global logistics. His days were a blur of meetings, video conferences, and power lunches where decisions worth millions were sealed over the clink of fine crystal. His phone never stopped buzzing with updates and inquiries, a constant reminder of the pace he maintained. Even the evenings, which others might have spent unwinding, were occupied with events that kept him connected to high society. Dinners were transactional, every conversation, every smile, a carefully played move on a board that stretched endlessly. Still, he made time for philanthropic work, ensuring that the Arnold Lynn name was synonymous with both power and generosity. It was the social engagements, though, that truly set the tempo of his life. Weekends vanished in a blur of gala invitations, charity balls, and art exhibitions where his presence was expected and his absence would raise questions. He moved through these events with an effortless charm, playing the role that had been etched into him from youth. But there were moments, as he loosened his tie late at night, when the silence reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. The memory of the lake, the laughter, and the scent of warm blueberry pie returned like a forgotten song, whispering of a life far simpler and richer than the one he so meticulously maintained. After their grandparents passed, the cabin had been left to Harry and his cousins, a shared legacy that spoke of summers spent laughing and barefoot on sun-warmed wood. But as the years rolled on and life led each of them down different paths, Harry found himself returning to the cabin more than anyone else. One by one, he bought out their shares, some cousins reluctant, their eyes turning wistful as they signed the papers, others detached, treating it as a transaction that held little meaning beyond a quick windfall. To Harry, the decision had never been about money. It was the preservation of a place that had been the backdrop to some of the happiest days of his life. The cabin stood solid on the lake's edge, a blend of aged cedar planks and green shutters that Harry had painted himself one late fall. It was as if each brushstroke stitched a piece of his heart back to those days when laughter echoed through the pines and fireflies lit the dusks. Now, instead of being the haven of family gatherings it once was, the cabin had become his private retreat, a place far removed from the polished marble floors of his penthouse or the constant murmur of voices in business meetings. Harry's life was filled with interactions and conversations, schedules crowded with back-to-back meetings, dinners where every word carried weight, and conferences that demanded he be sharp and commanding. Yet, deep within, he knew himself to be an introvert, someone who drew true strength from silence, from time spent in reflection. The cabin offered him exactly that. Unlike the buzzing summer days of the past, he chose to visit during autumn and winter, when the chill brought a different kind of solitude, one that sharpened the air and made the world feel like it held its breath just for him. Over the years, his responsibilities multiplied like branches on a tree, stretching and reaching into every corner of his life. The cabin became harder to visit, but he never neglected it. He hired local caretakers to keep it pristine, stocked the pantry with canned goods, and ensured the fireplace never went without a pile of logs. Sometimes, after a particularly taxing week, he would imagine the creak of the front porch under his feet or the way the lake's surface reflected the silver moon. It was a small comfort, a promise to himself that the space was waiting, unchanged. The calendar blinked with obligations, dinners, charity auctions, meetings with influential stakeholders, all events marked in gold lettering, shouting of importance. Yet, as the season shifted to the cusp of winter, Harry found himself craving the kind of quiet that no boardroom or ballroom could offer. He glanced at the RSVP cards that cluttered his desk, names blurring into insignificance. There was one choice that called to him louder than any glittering event: the cabin. It was a subtle defiance against the life he had crafted so carefully. He sent a quick email to his assistant, Anna, marked with a simple instruction: clear the weekend. The weight of those 3 words lifted something deep in his chest. With the decision made, Harry turned his attention to preparations. He arranged for the caretaker to visit, stock up on essentials, and ensure the cabin was warm and ready. He dismissed the idea of bringing his driver. This was a journey he needed to make alone. The thought of navigating the winding roads himself, the steady hum of the car under his command, felt like a return to a simpler version of himself. His phone buzzed with a reminder of a charity gala that evening. He silenced it, feeling the gentle tug of guilt before brushing it away. He had given more of himself this year than he cared to admit: donations, time, even energy spent ensuring the company upheld its social commitments. But now, he owed himself a few days of stillness. There were moments a person needed to reclaim, not for duty or image, but for the simple fact of being human. As he packed, Harry found himself reaching for the small, familiar things: a soft cashmere sweater, the scarf his mother had knit him years ago, and a leather-bound journal with blank pages that always seemed too precious to fill. He tucked a book into his bag, a novel he'd started a dozen times but never finished. The last item was a photo, one of the few he kept in a frame, a younger version of himself, flanked by Grandma May and Grandpa Tom, their expressions warm and unguarded. Stepping into the crisp air of the garage, Harry felt a different kind of anticipation bloom in his chest. The drive ahead would wind through landscapes that spoke of home, where the trees gathered like old friends and the lake waited, as patient as it was timeless. With each mile, he hoped the silence would remind him of something he'd almost forgotten: the part of himself that lived outside the gleaming skyscrapers, the Harry who had once splashed through the shallows without a care, the boy who still believed in laughter and the scent of warm pies cooling in the sun. As the city lights began to dwindle behind him, Harry felt the tight knot of constant obligation start to loosen. The road curved ahead, leading him back to a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach, and where, for a few days at least, he could just be. The road wound through a patchwork of forests and open fields, the trees standing tall like silent guardians. Harry had been driving for hours, his fingers tapping idly on the steering wheel as he hummed a forgotten tune. The rhythmic thrum of tires against asphalt was soothing, a rare moment when he felt connected to something simple and unhurried. But then, with a sputter and a jolt, the car shuddered, and the dashboard lit up with warning signs. The engine coughed one last time before surrendering, leaving Harry stranded on a remote stretch with no signal on his phone. He stepped out, the cold biting at his skin as the wind swept through the empty landscape. The road stretched endlessly, bordered by bare trees and fields browned by the season. He glanced down both ends, the silence pressing on him with an unfamiliar weight. No headlights glimmered in the distance, the solitude was absolute. With no other choice, Harry locked the car and started walking, each step crunching on the gravel, the sound and echo of the past he was hoping to reconnect with. The sun had dipped lower, casting long, thin shadows by the time he spotted it, a small diner nestled near the bend of the road, its neon sign flickering weakly. The sight was as unexpected as a secret tucked into a well-worn book. He pushed open the door, a bell chiming his arrival, and was met with the comforting hum of quiet conversation and the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingling with something sweet. The diner had a cozy warmth, its checkered floors scuffed by years of stories, and a jukebox in the corner playing an old tune that seemed like it had been there forever. A few heads turned his way, curiosity flickering across the faces of the patrons before they returned to their meals. Harry walked to the counter and caught the attention of a waitress in her 50s, her eyes kind and lined at the corners. "Car trouble," he said with a slight smile. "Is there a phone I could use?" She nodded, reaching for an old rotary phone beneath the counter and pushing it toward him. "Tow company's number is taped to the side," she added with a touch of sympathy. Harry dialed, his voice steady as he explained his predicament and arranged for help. The call ended with a promise that a truck would come in the next couple of hours. With little else to do, Harry glanced around and chose a booth by the window, the vinyl seat squeaking as he sat down. His gaze wandered to the wall opposite him, lined with photos in mismatched frames, each one a piece of history preserved under glass. He leaned forward, squinting at the collage. The images were black and white, some faded to a sepia tone, faces maiming with the energy of moments long past. Children posing by the lake, a group of women in summer dresses laughing as if at a shared secret. One photograph made Harry pause. His grandmother, unmistakable with her bright eyes and confident posture, stood arm in arm with a woman he didn't recognize. They looked joyous, the kind of joy that spoke of deep bonds and shared adventures. Harry's brow furrowed, the woman beside her seemed familiar in a way he couldn't quite place. The waitress, whose name tag read Diane, came back with a slice of pie and a steaming cup of coffee. "Best to have something warm while you wait," she said, setting them down with practiced ease. "Thank you," Harry said, his voice absent as his attention remained on the photo. "Do you know anything about those pictures?" He gestured to the wall. Diane followed his gaze, eyes narrowing as she considered the images. Sure," she said. "That wall's been up for decades. Folks come in, leave a bit of themselves behind." She pointed to one photo of a local fishing competition. "But the woman who owns the diner, Margaret, she'd be the one to really ask. She's got stories about nearly every one of those photos." Harry looked back at the photo of his grandmother. "When will she be in?" "Tomorrow morning," Diane said, smiling. "Margaret doesn't miss a morning shift." A sigh escaped Harry as he settled back, accepting the wait. He picked up his fork and took a bite of the pie. The buttery crust crumbled on his tongue, the filling sweet with a tart edge that made him close his eyes. It was an exact match to Grandma May's, the taste whisking him back to the summers at the cabin, his fingers sticky with berries, laughter spilling into the open air. The warmth of the diner, combined with the bittersweet taste of the pie, stirred something deep in him. It was strange, like unearthing a piece of himself that had long been buried. The chatter of the patrons, the clink of mugs, even the low hum of the jukebox, It was all so different from his structured life but familiar in a way that tugged at his chest. He glanced at the photo wall again, thoughts swirling as questions began to form. Who was the woman beside his grandmother? Why hadn't she ever been mentioned? And why did this small roadside diner, with its photos and its pie, feel like it held a piece of his own story? Harry looked out the window as twilight wrapped the landscape in shades of blue. The tow truck would come, he would reach the cabin, but tonight, he knew sleep would evade him. The questions would follow him through the stillness, whispering in the gaps where silence once comforted him. The early morning chill hung in the air as Harry stepped out of his car, now parked neatly at the edge of the gravel lot. He scanned the familiar exterior of the diner, its neon sign buzzing softly, casting a glow that seemed more welcoming in the morning light. The memory of the previous night's discovery had gnawed at him, making sleep impossible. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door, the bell chiming its friendly greeting. Inside, the scene was calm, a few regulars sipping coffee and flipping through newspapers. The warm scent of syrup and fresh bread drifted through the room, bringing with it a sense of comfort that Harry hadn't realized he missed. He glanced at the wall of photos once more, the old black and whites holding secrets he was determined to uncover. Back so soon? Diane called from behind the counter, a grin breaking her lined face. Harry nodded, offering a polite smile as he approached. Is Margaret in today? Just got in, actually, Diane replied, jerking her chin toward a door behind the counter. Give me a second, I'll let her know you're here. A few moments later, the door swung open, and Harry found himself staring in shock. A woman stood before him, her features strikingly familiar, high cheekbones, bright eyes that seemed to hold a hint of mischief. She wasn't his grandmother, but the resemblance was uncanny, as if she'd stepped straight out of the past. You must be Harry Arnold Lynn, she said, her voice warm but steady. Diane said someone was asking about the photos. He managed to find his voice, the question escaping almost involuntarily. How do you know my name? The woman's smile widened, softening her features. I knew your grandmother well. My name is Margaret. I'm her sister. A stunned silence fell over him, as if the world had paused to allow the weight of her words to sink in. His grandmother had a sister? He glanced back at the photo, then at Margaret. The similarities were undeniable, the way she held herself, the crinkle at the edges of her eyes when she smiled. I never knew, Harry whispered, disbelief coloring his tone. She never mentioned you. Margaret's expression faltered for a moment, a shadow of old hurt crossing her face before she regained her composure. It doesn't surprise me, she admitted. Your grandfather, he wasn't one for keeping family close. He liked things controlled, quiet. Summers at the cabin were the only times May and I could see each other without him knowing. They were our secret, our escape. The room seemed to shrink as Harry took in her words. Memories of his grandfather's stern demeanor surfaced, strict rules and a voice that left no room for argument. It made sense in a way that both saddened and unsettled him. He had always thought of those summers as idyllic, untouched by the complexities of adulthood. Now, he realized they held a layer of defiance he'd never known. Why didn't she tell me? Harry asked, more to himself than to Margaret. He had thought he knew everything about his grandmother, her strength, her laughter that could fill a room, the way she would hold his hand and tell him stories of when she was young. But this was something else entirely. People have their reasons, Margaret said, her voice gentler now. She pulled out a chair across from Harry and sat down, gesturing for him to do the same. She loved you, you know. Spoke of you often, even when we couldn't be together as much as we wanted. When she passed, I thought about reaching out, but life gets in the way. Harry sank into the chair, the old vinyl creaking under his weight. The realization washed over him like the tide. He wasn't just here because of a broken car or a restless spirit. He was here to piece together parts of his family that had been hidden, tucked away like forgotten heirlooms in an attic. "Tell me more about her," he said, the words catching slightly in his throat. "About you too." Margaret's eyes softened, her smile returning with a touch of nostalgia. Oh, May was always the brave one. Always finding little ways to break the rules. She'd sneak us out to the lake, just the two of us, and we'd swim until we were exhausted. When I look at that photo, I remember those days. The laughter, the shared secrets. We didn't have much, but we had each other. The picture of his grandmother started to shift in Harry's mind. She wasn't just the caretaker of fond memories, she was a woman who had lived a life full of choices, compromises, and hidden strength. And here was Margaret, a part of that story, woven into the fabric of their shared past but never spoken of. Harry's voice dropped, a new emotion creeping in. Did she ever come back here? To this town? Margaret nodded, her expression a blend of fondness and something deeper. Once or twice. She came to see me, quietly. And when she did, she always asked me to make her the pie she loved. Same recipe that you tasted last night. She paused, studying Harry's reaction. That's why you're here, isn't it? You recognized it. He swallowed hard, memories colliding in his mind, summers filled with the tang of wild blueberries, the feeling that a slice of pie was more than dessert, but a gesture of love. Yes, he admitted. It brought me back in a way I didn't expect. The diner felt different now, as if the air was filled with stories waiting to be told, and Harry knew he wasn't just passing through. This place held echoes of his grandmother, and Margaret held the keys to unlock them. He glanced at the photo wall again, this time seeing it for what it was, a chronicle of moments that had existed just beyond his reach. Can we talk more? About her, about the summers? Harry asked, a tentative hope in his voice. Margaret's smile widened, eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'd like that, she said softly. And in that moment, Harry felt a connection, not just to her, but to a history that was finally beginning to unfold. Harry sipped the hot coffee that Diane had refilled for him, the warmth easing the chill that had settled in his chest since stepping into the past with Margaret. They sat together in the corner booth, a morning sunbeam lighting up the dust motes in the air like tiny, dancing stars. The diner, now part of a story far deeper than he had expected, felt more familiar by the minute. Margaret's gaze was filled with the comfort of shared memories as she leaned forward to tell him more. Your grandmother was always happiest in this town, Margaret said, her voice dipping into a place of quiet affection. People here knew her, not as the matriarch of the Arnold Lynn family, but just as May, the girl who could skip stones farther than anyone else, who danced barefoot when the band played at the summer fairs. This town remembers her the way she wanted to be remembered. Harry nodded slowly, taking in the room and its quaint charm. He hadn't realized how much of his grandmother's life had been tied to this place, how much of her essence had been shaped by a world that valued stories over status and gatherings over grand gestures. The photo wall behind them suddenly felt like an invitation, a door he had never known to open until now. You mentioned family, Harry said, his voice softer, more uncertain. Are there more of us here? Margaret chuckled, the sound rich and warm. Oh, you wouldn't believe it. The town's full of cousins, second cousins, great-aunts, and old friends who might as well be kin. Your grandmother made sure she stayed close to everyone who stayed behind. Even when your grandfather kept his distance, she found her ways. A smile touched her lips, as if she were recalling a moment when May had outwitted her husband. Summers at the cabin weren't just for fun, they were her bridge back to this life. Harry's mind drifted back to those days at the lake, the laughter of kids who weren't just friends but distant relatives he'd lost touch with over the years. Faces blurred by time and age became clearer now, framed by Margaret's stories. He felt a pang of regret for never asking more, for not realizing that those fleeting connections were threads of a much larger tapestry. We used to play tag until the sun went down, he murmured, more to himself than to her. I remember thinking those were the longest days of my life. Margaret's eyes sparkled. And that's exactly what May wanted for you, to know those days, to live them without worry. The world she left behind when she married your grandfather wasn't just a memory. It was a place she carried in her heart and shared with you whenever she could. The clinking of plates and the low hum of conversation from the other patrons grounded Harry in the present, but the stories pulled him deeper into his roots, tracing pathways he hadn't known existed. It was as if the past had been layered beneath everything he thought he understood, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. So, what happened when the summers ended? Harry asked, sensing there was more to the story. Margaret's smile dimmed, and she folded her hands on the table, fingers tracing invisible patterns. She'd go back, of course. Back to a life where your grandfather's rules were rigid, and expectations were set like stone. But she never let that world touch this one. She'd write letters, send little gifts, your grandfather never knew. It was her way of keeping the connection alive. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. You look so much like her, you know. The comparison caught Harry off guard, and he glanced at his reflection in the window. The lines on his face, the stern expression he wore like armor, it was hard to imagine any resemblance to the carefree spirit Margaret described. Yet, a part of him longed to believe it, to think he was more than the man shaped by boardrooms and business deals. Before he could respond, Margaret leaned back, eyes twinkling again. We're having a gathering tomorrow. Not the polished kind you're used to, but one filled with chatter and music and kids running around with sticky hands. You should come. The invitation hung in the air, simple and unassuming but layered with meaning. Harry's instinct was to refuse. He had a reputation to maintain, obligations waiting. But those obligations suddenly felt hollow compared to the chance to sit among people who shared his blood, to hear stories and laughter that carried traces of his grandmother's voice. I don't know, he began, hesitating. I wouldn't want to intrude. Margaret reached across the table, her fingers brushing his in a gesture that was both comforting and insistent. This is your family, Harry. There's no such thing as intruding. A pause lingered between them, filled with the rustle of newspaper pages and the scrape of forks against plates. He could feel the pull, like the lake calling him to jump in as a boy, the water cool and alive. The cabin wasn't just a place to be alone, it was a reminder that solitude had once been shared with love, not imposed by the demands of a life he'd carefully constructed. All right, Harry said finally, the decision blooming in his chest like the first breath of spring. I'll be there. Margaret's face lit up, and she clapped her hands once, a gesture so familiar that Harry felt a rush of warmth. It was a piece of May, preserved in her sister's excitement. Good, Margaret said. You'll see that some things are worth holding on to, no matter how far you've gone. As he left the diner, the morning sun cast long shadows over the town, each building and tree holding a part of a story he was only beginning to understand. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the town, gilding the rooftops and stretching the shadows of maple trees across the narrow streets. Harry stood outside Margaret's modest house, where the sound of voices and laughter spilled out into the crisp air. The air was filled with the scent of roasted turkey, spiced cider, and baked apples, a medley that made his stomach tighten with a feeling he hadn't realized he missed. Margaret opened the door before he even knocked, her smile wide and welcoming. Come on in, Harry, she said, ushering him inside. The living room was cozy, a patchwork of worn furniture and handmade quilts draped over the backs of chairs. A record player in the corner spun a soft tune, crackling faintly, while kids darted around playing an impromptu game of tag. The room was filled with people, relatives whose names he didn't yet know but who greeted him as though he'd been a part of their lives for years. Harry. Come meet your cousins. Margaret's voice carried across the room as she guided him to a group gathered around an old photo album. The introductions blurred for a moment, but the warmth in each handshake and hug was tangible, easing the awkwardness he'd anticipated. Stories began to flow naturally, weaving between jokes and shared memories. Do you remember the time May challenged everyone to a watermelon eating contest and won by a mile? An older man said, his eyes twinkling with the memory. Harry chuckled, picturing his grandmother, competitive streak and all, slamming her fists on the table in victory. He didn't know that story, but it felt as if he could see it happening as clearly as if it were a movie playing out in front of him. Dinner was laid out on a long table set with mismatched chairs and platters that ranged from family heirlooms to chipped dishes with painted flowers. The centerpiece was a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers, tied together with twine. Margaret tapped a glass lightly, signaling for a pause in the lively conversation. "I'm glad to see everyone here today, old faces and new," she began, her eyes finding Harry in the crowd. "We've been blessed with stories that connect us, and today we share them to keep those we've lost alive in our hearts." A moment of silence settled over the group, followed by nods and murmurs of agreement. Then, as if on cue, a child giggled and the spell was broken, replaced by a chorus of laughter. Plates clattered as food was passed around: mashed potatoes, green mains, a turkey carved with more enthusiasm than precision. Harry served himself and listened as the stories continued. Someone recounted the time his grandmother had taken the town's Christmas choir and led them door to door singing carols off-key on purpose, just to make everyone laugh. Another spoke of summers where the entire town would gather by the lake for bonfires, the smoke mingling with the scent of pine and laughter ringing out into the night. He leaned back in his chair, a smile lingering on his face as he felt something unfurl in his chest, a lightness that contrasted sharply with the suffocating demands of his usual life. This wasn't an event measured by fine suits and networking opportunities, but a gathering that radiated sincerity. Here, no one spoke of profit margins or negotiated contracts between bites. Here, stories and the people who carried them were the only currency. A young girl, no older than 6, tugged at his sleeve, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Did you know Grandma May?" she asked, holding a biscuit in one hand. Harry nodded, bending slightly to meet her gaze. "I did. She taught me how to fish when I was about your age. She'd say you had to be as patient as the lake itself." The girl's giggle was quick and bright. "That's funny. I can't be patient at all," she confessed, before darting back to a game with her siblings. As the evening deepened, so did the conversations. Harry found himself beside an older cousin named Arnold, who shared a knowing look. "Didn't think you'd show up," Arnold said, not unkindly. "Neither did I," Harry admitted, a trace of self-reflection in his tone. "But I'm glad I did." Arnold nodded. "Margaret was worried this world was lost on you. But your grandmother would be proud, seeing you here, finding your way back." The comment landed with a soft weight, wrapping around him like the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The peace that settled over him spoke louder than words. Dessert came out in a flurry of plates, pies of every flavor imaginable: pumpkin, apple, blueberry. Harry reached for a slice of blueberry pie, the same kind he'd tasted at the diner. He took a bite and felt that familiar twinge of nostalgia, now accompanied by a new emotion: belonging. He noticed Margaret watching him, a knowing smile on her face. "Good?" she asked from across the table. "Better than good," Harry replied, his voice steady, genuine. And it was true. For once, the silence he felt was not the lonely kind that crept into his penthouse when the city finally quieted. It was the contentment that came from shared laughter and the warmth of being surrounded by those who, without question or condition, made room for him. When the evening finally wound down and children were carried to beds, cheeks pink and eyes heavy with sleep, Harry found himself lingering. The air was cool but carried the scent of smoke and the last notes of laughter, hanging on like a promise. Margaret wrapped an arm around his shoulders, squeezing gently. "You're part of this, Harry. Always have been. It's just nice to see you realize it." He swallowed past the lump in his throat, nodding as he looked out at the stars. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, for the first time in years, he felt whole. The morning light crept through the sheer curtains of Margaret's living room, casting soft shadows across the floor. Harry sat in the armchair by the window, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He watched as the street began to wake, neighbors waving as they walked their dogs and children shouting gleefully as they pedaled their bikes through the chilly air. The simplicity of it struck him, how different it was from the city mornings filled with traffic and hurried footsteps. Here, life moved at its own pace, each moment unfurling without pressure or pretense. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, a dish towel thrown over her shoulder, and opened the door to reveal an elderly man with a wide-brimmed hat and a grin that reached his eyes. "Morning, Margaret. Thought I'd stop by with some of that peach jam you like," the man said, holding up a small jar. His gaze shifted to Harry. "And who do we have here? You must be May's grandson." Harry stood, extending a hand. "Yes, Harry. Nice to meet you. Name's George. I grew up with your grandma. We used to get into all sorts of trouble," George chuckled, eyes crinkling with memories. The conversation flowed easily, each shared story filling gaps Harry hadn't known existed. George painted pictures of his grandmother's younger days, her wild streak, her kindness, and her fierce loyalty to those she loved. Harry felt something shift within him, as if a missing puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. This town, these people, were not just part of his grandmother's past, they were now part of him, too. The day unfolded like a slow, beautiful symphony. Harry walked down Main Street, where shopkeepers greeted him with nods and neighbors paused to introduce themselves. The local bookstore, with its crooked sign and shelves packed tight, drew him in. He browsed titles while chatting with the owner, a woman named Crystal, who wore oversized glasses and spoke in a voice as gentle as the rustling pages. "I remember your grandmother coming in here to pick out books for the cabin," Crystal said, her eyes twinkling. "She always said that a good story was like a friend that stayed with you, even after you closed the cover." Harry smiled, feeling a deep sense of connection to this place where stories and lives intertwined seamlessly. The town wasn't just a backdrop, it was a living piece of who he was. Later, he found himself helping Margaret in her garden, the crisp air carrying the scent of pine and the faint, sweet aroma of soil. They worked side by side, pulling up the last of the season's carrots and laughing as a small, scruffy dog from next door attempted to chase a squirrel up a tree. "You know, Harry," Margaret said, straightening with a content sigh, "I think May always hoped you'd find your way back here. She knew how hard life at the top could be, how it shapes you in ways that sometimes make you forget who you really are." He wiped the dirt from his hands, the words settling deep in his mind. "I think she knew me better than I knew myself." Margaret reached over and patted his arm, her touch light but filled with understanding. "Stay as long as you need to. This town has a way of reminding you of what matters." Days turned into weeks, each one blurring gently into the next as Harry became more woven into the fabric of town life. He fixed fences, attended local game nights at the community center, and found himself on first-name terms with half the town. He'd never known that a grocery store visit could take over an hour because of the conversations that popped up in every aisle, or that laughter could come so easily when surrounded by people who expected nothing from him but his company. The changes were subtle at first, a shift in the way he relaxed his shoulders, the way he laughed without reservation. But soon, Harry felt the weight he had carried for years begin to fall away. He found joy in the simple things, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, the sound of rain tapping on the roof, the warmth of a fire crackling in Margaret's living room as she recounted stories about his grandmother that hadn't made it into family photo albums. One afternoon, while helping a neighbor, Eva, repair her old wooden fence, Harry felt a different kind of spark. Eva was a schoolteacher with a quick wit and a smile that seemed to light up everything around her. They fell into easy conversation as they worked, talking about everything from childhood memories to their favorite books. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Harry felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fading sunlight. The realization that this place, with its open hearts and quiet moments, was where he felt most himself was both startling and comforting. He thought of the stark contrast between this life and the one waiting for him back in the city. There, his days were outlined by agendas and driven by the ticking clock. Here, time was shared with people who valued him not for what he could achieve, but for who he was. The decision to stay longer came naturally. He called his assistant, Anna, and rearranged meetings, delegating responsibilities he'd once clutched tightly. The cabin, which had been a solitary retreat, became a place to host friends, share meals, and listen to music that spilled out into the night. He didn't just visit anymore, he belonged. Harry found himself thinking less about contracts and deals, and more about planting a garden in the spring, about the book club Margaret hinted she might start, and about the way Eva's laugh seemed to echo in his mind long after she was gone. With each day, Harry's sense of belonging grew, not just as May's grandson, but as Harry, someone who understood the value of connection, the beauty of a simple life, and the joy of being surrounded by people who made every day feel like coming home. The snow began to melt in the first days of spring, leaving patches of damp earth and the first hints of wildflowers on the edges of town. Harry stood in front of the community center, a modest building that buzzed with new energy. Thanks to his investment, the place now sported a fresh coat of paint and a refurbished play area for the children. But it wasn't just money that had transformed it. Harry had spent hours here himself, painting walls, hammering nails, and listening to the stories of locals who stopped by to pitch in or just share coffee and conversation. The satisfaction of seeing kids racing around the new playground or hearing the laughter of neighbors as they played board games on the newly built porch was unlike anything he'd felt in his old life. He wasn't just an outsider passing through, he was part of their stories now. It was during one of these afternoons that Eva joined him, her brown hair catching the light as she watched the kids with a smile. "You've really brought this place back to life," she said, handing him a cup of iced tea. Their fingers brushed, and even after months of seeing her nearly every day, the small gesture sent a spark through him. "Couldn't have done it without everyone's help," Harry replied, taking a sip. The tea was sweet with a hint of lemon, exactly how he liked it. "Still, you led the way," Eva said, tilting her head thoughtfully. "It's not often someone comes in and chooses to stay. Most people think they'll find what they're looking for here, but you found it and then gave back." He turned to meet her eyes, seeing the understanding there, the quiet acknowledgement of what he had left behind to make this place his home. "I didn't know what I was missing until I found it," he admitted, his voice low, steady. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sound of kids' laughter. As weeks turned into months, Harry's involvement in the town deepened. He supported local projects, funding the renovation of the town library, helping set up a scholarship fund for students wanting to pursue college, and even sponsoring a summer fair that echoed the memories of his childhood. The community thrived, not just because of his contributions, but because everyone was a part of it. Each event brought more laughter, more stories, and more memories that Harry tucked away like treasures. In evenings, he and Eva would walk through the town, talking about everything from their favorite books to their childhood dreams. It was during one such walk, under a sky dotted with stars, that he paused and took her hand. "Eva," he began, heart thumping in his chest, "I used to think my life was about building something impressive, something that everyone could see and point to as success. But here, with you, I realized it's about building moments, connections, and a life worth living." She looked up at him, eyes bright, and before he could say more, she kissed him, the warmth of it chasing away the chill of the evening. From that moment, they were no longer just two people finding their way, they were a pair, a future wrapped in shared smiles and whispered dreams. The day they married was a simple, joyful affair. Margaret helped with the preparations, arranging wildflowers for the tables and telling everyone stories that made them laugh until they had tears in their eyes. Harry stood at the edge of the lake, waiting for Eva, his heart full as he remembered the summers of his youth and realized how far he had come. When she walked toward him, a vision in a dress that swayed in the breeze, he felt a peace so deep it almost overwhelmed him. The vows they exchanged were honest and heartfelt, promises woven with laughter and knowing looks. They spoke of love that grew not out of grand gestures, but from shared mornings and walks in the garden, from teasing glances and long conversations over cups of tea. The cabin, once a place of solitude, became their home, a place that welcomed not just them but everyone they loved. Over time, the cabin's rooms echoed with new sounds, the patter of small feet, the gleeful shouts of children playing hide and seek, and the clatter of cousins running up and down the porch steps. Holidays were marked by tables laden with food, family gathered around with stories and laughter that spilled out into the night. Margaret would sit in her favorite chair, eyes glistening as she watched generations blend, stories overlap, and new memories be made. The lake once more reflected the golden hues of carefree afternoons as Harry and Eva's children raced each other along its shore, their cousins in tow. Harry often found himself on the old dock, watching them with a smile that spoke of contentment. Eva would join him, slipping her hand into his as they sat, their feet dangling over the water, the sounds of family life all around them. Harry realized that his grandmother's wish had come full circle. The cabin, which had started as a place for summer retreats, had evolved into a symbol of continuity and love, drawing people together through generations. It no longer held only his memories, it cradled the laughter of his children, the warmth of his wife's voice, and the stories told by cousins who were no longer distant but close, bound by the same joy that had once belonged solely to summers long past. And so, every season, Harry and Eva opened their doors wide, welcoming family and friends for gatherings that felt more like homecomings than events. They played music, told stories, and shared meals that carried the flavors of tradition. The cabin, alive with chatter and affection, stood not just as a retreat, but as the heart of a life that was full, lived in the best of company.